Yeah, that seems, again, when we talk about furthering the U.S. national interest, we have so many interests, it seems, right? When it comes to facilitating our standard of living, when it comes to protecting our security interests, that's a big issue, but it's so vague that that could mean just about anything, it seems. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, or give me your perspective, that the thing that we want to do as we're allocating resources to make the world a better place, is to also modify some of the behaviors that characterize who we are. So that maybe some of these investments will produce some of the results that we want to see. For instance, if we decide to invest in peace and security in the Middle East, if we dampen down our dependence on oil or foreign energy resources, then we might have the ability to have those resources used for the purpose that they're intended for, and it might actually engender some confidence in that region that we have, above the table aims in terms of giving this money. The perception, it seems now, is that we don't, is that we're giving this money purely because of economic interest. We really don't care about the people. We really don't care about that region of the world outside of Israel, and we're simply giving so that we can get something in the long term. And I think that sort of perception engenders a bit of hostility, and it definitely limits the extent to which we can have discussions and provide bilateral education or communication opportunities that might facilitate better relationships amongst countries, especially us in relation to a lot of those Middle Eastern countries.
I agree. I mean, that's why when we look at the two largest categories, the one being the peace and security, which a lot of the lion's share goes in towards military spending, the second being in the area of health. Now that's where I believe we do have that moral sense of obligation, which you even saw back in the Middle Ages, noblesse oblige, where the rich kings and princes owed to their poorer subjects a certain sense of loyalty, of looking out for their better interests. And so whether we want to think of ourselves as the empire, going out and doing what we can to help others, that's, I believe, the part where there's an ethical answer, that we are trying to resolve those issues, both to prevent the spread and the buildup of diseases in other countries, which with globalization can travel the planet in an instant, as we saw during the Hong Kong and swine flu scares.
Very good.
We can't have a separate underclass in which their standard of living is so low and they are so ill and so weakened from lack of food that diseases can manifest themselves that wouldn't otherwise be able to, so that we have to, even within our own borders, that's a problem. Right? When we look at the issue of immigrants, if we don't provide them health care and we allow that situation to fester, then we're creating an environment internally, as much as in foreign aid, we're creating an environment externally in which diseases could run rampant and people could succumb to things that would not necessarily affect them and mutate and affect the rest of us.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the scope of U.S. influence, and it seems like we have our hands in a lot of different affairs around the world, but it makes sense because we're the only superpower and we have that sort of influence. But you mentioned earlier this whole idea of addressing historical episodes of, well, not just the U.S. taking advantage of other peoples to position themselves economically and politically, but even making up for a lot of the turmoil that's been produced by other nations historically. To what extent should the U.S. be solving these problems? To what extent should we be investing money to solve these issues? I would, just to play devil's advocate here, I can imagine many of our viewers saying to themselves, yeah, we give so many billions of dollars in aid money to these countries, but we have we have over 15 million people either underemployed or unemployed in this country who could use those resources as well. So to what extent should we be attempting to cure historical ills versus us, again, investing in who we are, investing in Americana?
Well, again, it comes down to that idea of interdependence. That is, to perhaps these countries have resources, minerals, assets, production capacities to do things that we can't, and that it provides them an opportunity to join us in the spread of globalization, the spread of democracy. I think one of the ideas is by providing this aid, that we are actually creating other cultures will help reinforce our ideology. And by that, it prevents the spread of terrorism, and it prevents those other things which could impact us economically. Yeah. And that is an important issue, to be able to spread the American belief of a human right of freedom and be able to pursue happiness. Yeah. It is that sense of security and the development of the concept of human right that is quite often missing in other countries. And we see that once it catches the spirit of a nation, they go in and they will fight in the streets to be able to change their leaders, to be able to pursue what they see in a document that's over 200 years old that we take for granted in this country.
Yeah.
And I believe in a way we ethically owe others the right to allow them to be free, and that we should do everything we can to support that freedom.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
And I can understand that being difficult for someone who's out of work and in the midst of it, trying to make the family payments for the family car in the house. And it is difficult. I really find that in the situation we're in right now, the economies of the rest of the world are all asking themselves the same questions. Can we afford to do this? And again, I would really go back to that religious blog asking, what would Jesus cut? Would he cut the aid to those small countries?
Very good.
I don't know if he necessarily would. Now, somebody may say, I don't want my tax dollars to go there, but I will tithe to the church. Well, it depends. With so few people going to churches, perhaps it's good that we are spending a few tax dollars there.
Very good. And who knows what Jesus in modernity would want? That might be a different Jesus.
That's correct.
Right?
That is correct.
Getting off the religious topic just for a second here and getting back to this foreign aid issue, when we talk about foreign aid, one of the things that's also a very important issue that we've discussed recently here in this forum is this idea of healthy sex practices.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the good things about foreign aid that we can point to is the fact that our giving to nations like Nigeria and other sub-Saharan African nations has definitely curbed the spread of HIV and AIDS.
That's correct.
And that's a really wonderful outgrowth of these types of policies, which you're basically alluding to. We can have those sort of effects. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about freedom, when we talk about what it means to be a healthy global citizen, just redefining that paradigm can also be some headway that we can make in terms of repositioning ourselves in the world community, because it seems like over time the American brand has been diminished by a lot of questionable leadership decisions.
Yeah, and I would like to concur with you on that idea, specifically about the HIV and AIDS issue in Africa. I read a book a while back, and I became interested in the issue of global slavery, and I've used it in my economics courses that are part of the global studies section. And in it, there was a chapter called The Demand for Slavery. And it follows the same patterns, modern slavery, as it did earlier slavery. Some of them sexual slaves, some in terms of household services. You may remember a case famous here in the U.S. of a wealthy family in New Jersey that kept a woman in a mattress downstairs in their house, raising their children.
Absolutely.
And it turns out, sadly, because of the death of all these parents through HIV and AIDS, that the cost of a slave right now in the Ivory Coast of Africa is $50 US. $50 US. If there's anything we can do that is so morally wrong, I don't care if somebody's unemployed here, to be able to prevent that child to go into that whole line of slavery, is definitely worth spending foreign aid on.
Yeah,
it's an important ethical consideration.
That seems to be the consensus, but again, I'm thinking about it as a citizen in one of those nations, right? And if you are somewhat skeptical of anything that's American, again, this is about this previous precedent that's been established through history. So we might have very good aims at the current moment in terms of wanting to produce something that's fundamentally good, but because of that baggage from the past, the people in that particular nation, in that society, no matter what we do, they're going to look at us and say, I don't want you here. How do we respect the wishes of the people indigenous to whatever land we're trying to give aid to? How do we respect their wishes and reach the proper sort of balance between, again, promoting what we think is a good paradigm for success societally, but then taking into consideration what people, natives to a land, might also think is the best?
Well, there's this concept that we use in disability studies, which comes over from ethnic studies, and that is that there is a sense of cultural competence, that you understand the culture you're working with, that you have to become and submersed in that culture to understand its social norms, the beliefs, the systems and ideologies of that culture, and then you have to operate within that culture in order to achieve those goals. And quite often, we just want to be able to step in, step out, and walk away, but it's going to take a great deal of time. And it's the anthropologists that are used to the soft skills, the qualitative end of the issue, which you and I as economists are always with the quantitative. Right. It is that qualitative, those soft skills, working with people, understanding them, reading people, that is necessary to be out there and should be supported. And through understanding those cultures, we can be able to make our values translate, not perfectly, but translate into their culture. And you know, when you talk about the changes in contraception, it makes me think about economic demography. You know, we have the demographic transition, right? And that is, when you look at any culture over time, you had Malthus, the famous reverend, that said that eventually people are just always going to have way too many children and will be dying.
The doomsday
The
scenario.
doomsday scenario, that's right. That's why we're called the dismal science.
That's right.
And he was just looking at the cycles of birth and death, saying that when workers earn wages that are very high, they end up having way too many children, and then it leads to death and then starvation because wages go down. And on the other hand, though, what we realize is that once we can provide those health benefits, such as the $9.7 billion that goes out for health care, that people will, if they have education, if they have a chance for a brighter future for themselves and for their children, they will end up having fewer children. The women will go into the labor market. They will find a way to make a living. They will use their money to be able to make their children's lives better, and they will have fewer children because the opportunity cost, that is the cost of staying home, becomes very expensive when I can now go out and work.
That's right. And it seems like, and not to cut you off, Antonio, but it seems like, just like in economics, we have evolution in the ideas and the sort of modeling that best describes the world we live in. Might something similar be happening with foreign aid, or should it happen with foreign aid? Should there be an evolution in the process of dispersing foreign aid to the extent that maybe we define a set of core competencies, a paradigm that we can vet foreign aid through, that can tell us this is a good foreign aid plan, this is a bad one? Something like that, would you?
Right, and we'd have to definitely do it within the cultural norms and respect the cultures of the countries and nations that we're working in and the regions of the world. Because if we try to impose our own standards, we're never going to be able to really get the set of outcomes that we want. Because again, it's going to be the Americans coming in the American way. And that isn't necessarily going to work in another country. I mean, that's why the book by Hernando de Soto, the Five Mysteries of Capital, in terms of why it is that capitalism fails in the West. There's a number of institutions that are missing in other countries. We've taken them for granted.
Very good.
And we have to establish them in those other countries.
And we do have an imposition of a certain standard here, and that is time limitation. So in 10 seconds, give me a final thought.
I do believe the U.S. has an obligation for foreign aid. We have both a moral and an economic obligation to be able to secure our interests across the globe. That what we can do, if I would say that there was some change, I would really take a second look at what we're spending on the defense of some of those countries, which may not be as democratic as we'd like them to be, and more authoritarian than we'd like to see.
Very good, Antonio. Thank you.
Thank you.
The motivations are many. The results are often varied, but the reality is that America spends billions of dollars across the globe. We encourage you to learn about how our government spends our money and get involved in a conversation with the decision makers that have influence far beyond our borders. For the professors, I'm Rashid Carter.